It begins, as these things often do, not with a siren, but with a quiet act of defiance. A woman walks into a police station, seeking nothing more than the service she's entitled to as a citizen. But in the cold, fluorescent glare of unchecked power, her presence itself is seen as a challenge. An arrogant officer, comfortable in his throne of petty authority and simmering prejudice, decides to make an example of her. A splash of hot coffee, a sneer, a dismissal. He thinks he's put her in her place, reinforced the unspoken rules. He has no earthly idea who he just crossed, because the woman wiping coffee from her stinging cheek isn't just another victim. She is the storm that has been gathering on the horizon. She is the new Chief Superintendent, and the carefully constructed world of corruption and fear within those station walls is about to collapse like a house of cards. Before this powder keg ignites, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. The battle for justice is about to begin, and you won't want to miss how it unfolds. The Brisbane police station hummed with a low-grade, stagnant energy. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile, unforgiving glow on scuffed vinyl floors and metal desks buried under mountains of paperwork. The air itself felt heavy, thick with unspoken resentments and the stale scent of institutional inertia. Power, unchallenged for too long, had created its own oppressive atmosphere. Into the stagnant pool stepped Grace Kirby, mid-50s, Aboriginal, dressed not in the crisp blue of command, but in a simple dark blouse and practical trousers. She moved with a quiet, centered confidence that drew subtle glances, then quick averting of eyes. Her long dark hair was tied back simply. No rank insignia visible, no entourage, just an ordinary citizen approaching the front desk. But Grace Kirby was far from ordinary. The room seemed to hold its breath, a subconscious recognition that her arrival signaled something, though no one yet knew what. At the front desk, Sergeant Doyle reigned over his cluttered domain. Built solid, with close-cropped, graying hair and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed in suspicion, he embodied the station's weary cynicism. He barely glanced up from his computer screen as Grace approached. "Yeah, what do you need?" he grunted, the question less an offer of help, more an expression of annoyance. His fingers tapped idly on the keyboard. "I'm here to report a theft," Grace stated, her voice steady, calm, carrying easily over the low hum. Doyle finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her appearance, making instant calculations based on ingrained prejudice. A smirk touched his lips. He leaned back, the worn chair creaking in protest, and let out a short, mocking laugh, loud enough for nearby officers to hear. "Let me guess," he sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. "Phone? Wallet? Waste of time, love. Those things are gone. Never see 'em again." Grace held her gaze, unflinching. The heat rose subtly in her cheeks, but her expression remained composed. "I understand that may be the case, Sergeant. Regardless, I wish to file a report. That is my right." Her quiet insistence seemed only to fuel his irritation. Doyle shoved his chair back noisily, grabbed his half-empty coffee cup, and stood, deliberately closing the distance between them. His physical presence was imposing, meant to intimidate. A few officers nearby visibly stiffened, suddenly finding intense interest in their own paperwork, their own computer screens. Silence descended again, thicker this time. "You know," Doyle said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "People like you need to learn your place. We got real police work to do here. Haven't got time for every little whinge that walks through the door." The slur, "you people," hung there, deliberate and ugly. Grace didn't react, didn't rise to the bait. She simply stood her ground, her silence a form of resistance he clearly didn't appreciate. And that's when he snapped. With a sudden, contemptuous flick of his wrist, Doyle tilted the styrofoam cup. A stream of lukewarm coffee splashed across Grace's face and down the front of her blouse. The sharp hiss of liquid hitting skin, the soft drip onto the floor, echoed in the stunned silence. Grace staggered back instinctively, a gasp escaping her lips. One cheek flared red, stinging from the unexpected assault, but her eyes, when they met Doyle's again, held no fear, only a cold, burning intensity that seemed to momentarily startle even him. The station held its breath. Near the break room, Constable Ben Carter, a rookie barely 6 months on the job, felt his fists clench. He took a half-step forward, driven by a raw instinct to intervene, but Doyle shot him a look. A quick, venomous glare that froze Carter in his tracks. The message was clear. Stay out of it. Everyone else adhered to the unspoken code. They looked away. They shuffled papers. They pretended nothing had happened. Complicity settled over the room like dust. Doyle regained his composure, his smirk returning. He set the dripping cup back on his desk. "Consider that a lesson," he muttered dismissively. "Now rack off before I decide to book you for loitering." Grace slowly raised a hand, not to her stinging cheek, but to calmly wipe the coffee from her face. The liquid left streaks on her skin, dripped onto the worn floor. She looked directly at Doyle, her voice quiet but laced with a chilling precision. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said. "Thank you for showing me exactly who you are, and exactly how things operate here." Then without another word, she turned and walked away. Her steps were measured, deliberate, echoing down the long hallway. Each footfall seemed to land with impossible weight. Doyle watched her go, then slumped back into his chair, chuckling softly to himself, confident he'd won, confident he'd put another troublemaker in her place. He didn't see the tremor in Ben Carter's hand. He didn't notice the uneasy glances exchanged between other officers once Grace was out of sight. He didn't comprehend the seismic shift that had just occurred. Grace Kirby continued down the corridor, the coffee trail marking her path, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead like dying stars. Her cheek throbbed, a physical manifestation of the insult, the injustice. But beneath the pain, a cold resolve settled deep in her bones. Kevin Doyle had no idea. He had just assaulted his new commanding officer. He had just declared war on the incoming Chief Superintendent. And Grace Kirby never backed down from a fight. Grace reached the end of the long, dingy hallway, stopping before an unmarked door. It creaked open, revealing Deputy Commissioner Michael Bell waiting in the relative dimness of his own office. Bell, a veteran with decades on the force, possessed a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with Doyle's bluster. His weathered face showed immediate concern as he took in the streaks of coffee on Grace's blouse, the faint redness blooming on her cheek. "Chief Superintendent," he began, his voice low. "Are you all right?" Grace stepped inside, the door clicking softly shut behind her. She took a deep breath, the first truly unguarded one since entering the station. She slowly removed the clip holding back her long, dark hair, letting it fall around her shoulders, a small act of reclaiming herself. "I'm fine, Michael," she replied, her voice tight despite the words. "But the station, it's worse than we anticipated." Bell nodded grimly. "I heard the commotion, heard Doyle. I wanted to step in, Grace, but you were clear about the approach." "I needed to see it firsthand," Grace confirmed, sinking into the visitor chair opposite his desk. "Needed to feel the temperature of the water before diving in, and Doyle just gave me a scalding introduction." She had spent the previous 2 weeks quietly observing, meeting with city officials, reviewing personnel files, all prelude to her official start date today. She knew there was resistance, knew there was rot, but experiencing Doyle's casual cruelty, the blatant racism, the absolute impunity with which he acted, and the chilling silence of the other officers, that clarified the battlefield. This wasn't just about implementing new policies. It was about dismantling a deeply entrenched culture of fear and corruption. Her mind flashed back, unbidden, to another moment of confrontation years ago. Her Auntie Marlene, a stalwart of the Aboriginal rights movement, standing firm against a line of hostile police during a land rights protest in Redfern. Grace, just a teenager then, had watched in anger as an officer shoved Marlene violently. She remembered the sting of tears, the surge of helpless rage, but she also remembered Marlene getting back up, wiping dust from her cheek, her eyes blazing with defiance. "They won't give us justice, love," Marlene had whispered later that day, her voice raspy but fierce. "We have to take it, bit by painful bit." That memory, that inherited resilience, had fueled Grace's unlikely path. She hadn't intended to wear a badge, hadn't envisioned herself inside the very system her Auntie Marlene fought against. But Marlene's words echoed. "You can't fix a broken system from the outside, Gracie. You gotta get inside, learn its weaknesses, then pull down the rotten bits and rebuild." So she had joined. Endured the academy, the skepticism, the subtle and overt resistance at every rank. She learned the rules, both written and unwritten. She climbed, steadily, strategically, never losing sight of the ultimate goal. Now, sitting in Bell's office, the sting on her cheek a fresh reminder of the fight ahead, she felt Marlene's spirit beside her. Doyle's assault wasn't just an insult. It was confirmation. Confirmation that complacency wasn't an option. confirmation that gradual change wouldn't suffice. This station needed a foundation-level reset. Belle interrupted her thoughts gently. Doyle thinks he got away with it. He'll be feeling confident, maybe careless. Grace met his gaze, a cold fire igniting in her eyes. Good, she said softly. Let him feel confident. Let him underestimate me. It makes the fall that much harder. She stood, straightening her blouse, ignoring the damp coffee stains. Michael, I need everything you have on Doyle. Every complaint, every whisper, every closed file professional standards conveniently lost. Belle nodded. Already started pulling it. There's a lot. More than was ever officially recorded. And the officers who witnessed it today? Grace asked. Who stayed silent? We know who they are, Belle confirmed grimly. Fear keeps them quiet. Doyle's got leverage on half the squad. Then we give them something stronger than fear, Grace stated. We give them hope, and we show them what real leadership looks like. She walked towards the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. Get ready, Michael. The quiet observation period is over. Starting tomorrow morning, the station gets a new chief superintendent. And things are about to change. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Belle alone in the quiet office. He looked at the closed door, then sighed. He knew Grace Kirby, knew her determination, knew the fire that drove her. Doyle had just thrown petrol on it, and the resulting blaze was going to consume more than just one arrogant sergeant. Sergeant Kevin Doyle strolled through the station the next morning with an extra swagger in his step. He'd put that woman in her place yesterday, thrown a little coffee, asserted his dominance, just routine maintenance in his world. He expected maybe a quiet word from an inspector, a CYA report filed and forgotten. Business as usual. He exchanged smug nods with his closest allies, officers who understood the real rules of the station. He deliberately ignored Constable Ben Carter, the rookie, who'd looked like he might actually grow a spine yesterday before freezing up. Doyle made a mental note to remind Carter later who held the power. He sauntered into the morning briefing room, grabbing a biscuit from the communal tin, leaning back against the wall, ready to zone out through the usual announcements. He didn't even register the shift in the room's energy at first. The sudden silence, the stiffening postures, the way all eyes turned towards the door. Then he saw her, Grace Kirby, standing in the doorway, not in the ordinary clothes from yesterday. Today, she wore the crisp, dark blue uniform of a Queensland Police Chief Superintendent. Rank insignia gleamed on her epaulettes. Her hair was impeccably styled. The faint mark on her cheek was barely perceptible, overshadowed by the sheer force of authority radiating from her. She walked to the front of the room, placed a leather folio on the table, and turned to face the stunned assembly. Good morning, she stated, her voice calm, clear, commanding. The room remained silent, thick with disbelief and dawning apprehension. Grace let the silence hang, her gaze sweeping across every face, lingering for a fraction of a second longer on Doyle. He felt that gaze like a physical touch, cold and sharp. I understand, Grace continued, her tone even, that yesterday was eventful for some of you. The understatement was chilling. For those who don't know me, allow me to introduce myself. She paused for effect. My name is Grace Kirby, and as of 0800 hours this morning, I am your new Chief Superintendent. A collective shockwave hit the room. Jaws dropped. Officers exchanged wide-eyed, panicked glances. At the back, Doyle went rigid, his smug confidence instantly evaporating, replaced by a look of utter disbelief, then dawning horror. The woman he'd assaulted, dismissed, threatened, was his boss. No way, Doyle muttered, the words escaping before he could stop them, loud enough to carry in the stunned silence. Grace's eyes snapped to him, locking onto his gaze with the laser precision. Oh yes, Sergeant Doyle, she replied, her voice dangerously soft. Very much so. The implication hung heavy. I know who you are. I know what you did. Doyle felt a cold sweat prickle his skin. He tried to regain his composure, crossing his arms, forcing a semblance of defiance, but the ground had irrevocably shifted beneath him. Grace addressed the room again. I've spent the past 2 weeks observing this station, she stated, assessing its strengths, its weaknesses, its culture. Her gaze lingered on the officers known to be Doyle's cronies. And let me be unequivocal. Things are going to change. Effective immediately. She outlined her initial directives. A full review of all pending misconduct complaints by Professional Standards Command, mandatory retraining in de-escalation, cultural sensitivity and implicit bias, the formation of an independent community liaison committee with real input, and a zero-tolerance policy for harassment and abuse of power. Each announcement landed like a hammer blow to the old way of doing things. Some officers nodded subtly, a flicker of hope in their eyes. Others looked down, avoiding eye contact. Ben Carter watched Doyle, saw the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface. Doyle remained silent throughout Grace's address, his mind racing, calculating, searching for an angle, a weakness. But Grace gave him no opening. She concluded the briefing with a final, pointed statement, her eyes again finding Doyle in the back. I expect professionalism, integrity, and respect from every officer under my command. For those unable or unwilling to meet those standards, the door's open. She closed her folio with a decisive snap. Dismissed. The officers filed out, a current of whispers and uneasy speculation following them. Doyle remained seated for a long moment, the briefing room emptying around him. He felt cornered, exposed, but Kevin Doyle wasn't wired for surrender. He was wired for survival, for dominance. As he finally pushed himself up from the chair, a cold, calculating glint returned to his eyes. Grace Kirby might have the title, the uniform, but he had the station, the network, the secrets. The war wasn't over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. Kevin Doyle didn't panic. He plotted. The shock of Grace Kirby's reveal morphed quickly into a cold, strategic anger. He retreated to the familiar shadows of the station, the corners where loyalty was bought with favors and silence was enforced by fear. Chief Superintendent? Fine. Titles meant nothing if the people under your command refused to follow. He began his counteroffensive subtly, starting with the officers indebted to him, the ones whose past mistakes he held like collateral. She's an outsider, he'd murmur in the break room near the coffee machine. Doesn't get how we do things here, thinks she can just waltz in and tear everything down. He played on their fears, their resentment of external authority, their suspicion of change. She's looking for scalps, he whispered to another group, trying to make a name for herself. Mark my words, none of us are safe. The whispers spread, poisoning the atmosphere. Officers became wary, hesitant to engage with Grace's proposed reforms. Paperwork related to her initiatives mysteriously slowed down. Anonymous complaints about minor procedural errors started appearing on her desk. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, designed to isolate her, undermine her authority, and paint her as incompetent. Grace felt the resistance immediately. The polite smiles turned strained. Meetings became exercises in obstruction. Information she requested was delayed or incomplete. Deputy Commissioner Bell confirmed her suspicions. He's rallying his base, Chief Superintendent, Bell reported grimly. Spreading rumors, calling in favors. He's trying to make the rank and file believe you're the enemy. Grace nodded, unsurprised. Let him, she said coolly. Let him show everyone exactly who he is. We stick to the plan. Focus on the evidence. While Doyle worked the inside game, the evidence Constable Ben Carter had provided became Grace's focus. The folder contained financial irregularities, internal memos hinting at cover-ups, and email chains suggesting coordination between Doyle and Counselor Marcus Thorne, the influential local politician. It wasn't enough for indictments yet, but it was a clear trail leading out of the station and into the corridors of city power. Grace and Bell, along with a small, trusted team working discreetly after hours, began meticulously cross-referencing the documents, searching for the linchpin, the undeniable proof that would connect Doyle's station-level corruption to Thorne's political maneuvering. Doyle, however, wasn't just working internally. He understood the power of public perception. Anonymous tips began flowing to specific local blogs and radio hosts known for their anti-establishment, often racially charged rhetoric. An article appeared, buried initially, but quickly amplified. New police chief's controversial past raises questions. It vaguely referenced an old, unrelated case from Grace's previous post, twisting facts to imply incompetence or worse. The narrative Doyle was seeding internally, she's an outsider with an agenda, began echoing in the public square. Small protests, initially just a handful of Doyle loyalists and disgruntled citizens, started appearing outside the station, carrying signs questioning Grace's qualifications, demanding transparency she was already working towards. Grace watched the protests from her window. The chants muffled but audible. It was a classic tactic. Create enough noise, enough doubt, to derail reform before it could gain traction. Bell stood beside her, his frustration palpable. We need to respond, Chief Superintendent. Issue a statement. Not yet, Michael. Grace replied firmly. Reacting now legitimizes their narrative. We respond with facts, with evidence, when the time is right. But the pressure was mounting. Ben Carter felt it acutely. Officers loyal to Doyle started making his shifts difficult. Backup slow to arrive. Equipment mysteriously malfunctioning. Pointed comments made just loud enough for him to hear. One evening, leaving the station, he found graffiti spray-painted on his car. Crude, racist, threatening. It was a clear escalation. A direct warning. Shaken but resolute, Carter reported the incident directly to Grace. He had crossed his Rubicon. There was no turning back now. He spent his off hours discreetly digging, remembering details Doyle had let slip over the years. Conversations overheard, files briefly glimpsed. He recalled Doyle bragging about mates in high places, specifically mentioning Counselor Thorne and sorting out inconvenient complaints related to council contracts. He brought this information to Grace, adding another layer to the conspiracy. The investigation intensified. Grace's team discovered a pattern. Companies linked to Thorne received lucrative council contracts shortly after potentially damaging police complaints against Doyle or his allies were quietly dismissed. The money trail was complex, deliberately obscured, but the connection was there. Doyle wasn't just abusing power. He was facilitating Thorne's corruption and likely benefiting from it. Doyle, sensing the net tightening, grew bolder. The attacks in the media became more personal, more vicious. A new article, citing anonymous police sources, accused Grace of having an inappropriate relationship with Deputy Commissioner Bell, attempting to discredit them both. It was a low blow, designed to sow chaos and distrust. Bell was furious. This crosses a line, Chief Superintendent. Grace remained calm, though the personal attack stung. It shows desperation, Michael. They're running out of legitimate ammunition. She knew they were close. The evidence connecting Doyle and Thorne financially was solidifying. Ben Carter's recollections provided crucial context. It was time to escalate. That night, working late, Grace drafted a comprehensive report detailing Doyle's misconduct, the financial links to Thorne, the evidence of obstruction, and the pattern of buried complaints, including Ben Carter's testimony about the destroyed files. She prepared copies for the State Director of Public Prosecutions, the Crime and Corruption Commission, and the Federal Police's Public Sector Integrity Unit. Doyle, believing he still controlled the internal narrative, was unaware that the storm he had tried to conjure against Grace was about to break directly over his own head. He thought he was playing chess, but Grace had been setting up a completely different board, one where his carefully placed pawns were about to be swept away. The truth, meticulously gathered and undeniable, was ready to be deployed. And the city of Brisbane was about to witness a cleansing fire. The air outside the Brisbane police station crackled with energy. Protesters lined the footpaths, their chants a rhythmic backdrop to the media scrum jostling for position near the entrance. Signs demanding justice and Grace Kirby's resignation competed for space. Inside her office, Grace watched the scene, her expression calm but focused. The campaign against her had reached a fever pitch, but today, the narrative would shift. She turned to her team, Deputy Commissioner Bell, Constable Ben Carter, and a few trusted senior officers. "This is it," Grace stated, her voice steady. "We go public." The plan, weeks in the making, was ready. The evidence was undeniable. The press conference was scheduled for noon. The room filled quickly. Reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder, cameras poised. When Grace stepped to the podium, a hush fell. She held a thick report folder. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice cutting through the expectant silence. "For too long, shadows have been allowed to lengthen within this command. Today we bring the light." She didn't waste time. Systematically, she laid out the evidence against Sergeant Kevin Doyle, the pattern of misconduct, the buried complaints, the financial links. But she didn't stop there. "This," she declared, holding up the report, "is not merely the story of one corrupt officer. It is the story of a network, enabled and protected by those in positions of power." She named Counselor Marcus Thorne, detailing the evidence connecting him to Doyle, the suspect contracts, the diverted funds, the clear pattern of quid pro quo. Sergeant Doyle provided the enforcement, Grace stated plainly, ensuring inconvenient problems disappeared. Counselor Thorne provided the political shield, ensuring Sergeant Doyle remained untouchable. She then addressed the smear campaign. "We have traced the funding for the recent anonymous attacks against my character and this investigation." She presented documents, bank transfers from a shell company directly linked to Thorne, funneling money to the blogs and individuals spreading the misinformation. This was a deliberate, funded attempt to obstruct justice, to intimidate witnesses, and to protect a corrupt enterprise. The room erupted. Questions flew. Cameras flashed. Just then, the doors at the back swung open. Kevin Doyle, defiant to the last, strode in, flanked by 2 loyalist officers. He clearly intended to disrupt, to reclaim control through sheer intimidation. "Lies!" Doyle yelled, marching down the aisle. "She's making it all up, framing me to cover her own tracks." Protesters outside surged towards the windows, their chants intensifying. Doyle reached the front, jabbing a finger towards Grace. "You think you can just destroy careers like this?" Grace met his furious gaze without flinching. "This command belongs to the people of Brisbane, Sergeant," she replied calmly, "not to those who abuse their oath." Doyle lunged towards the podium, rage distorting his features. Before he could reach Grace, Bell and officers from the newly formed Integrity Unit intercepted him, physically restraining him. "Get off me!" Doyle roared, struggling. "Thorne will hear about this!" His own words, caught by every microphone, sealed his fate. At that moment, a senior investigator from the Crime and Corruption Commission stepped forward. "Sergeant Kevin Doyle?" His voice boomed over the chaos. "You are under arrest for bribery, misconduct in public office, perverting the course of justice, and conspiracy." The handcuffs clicked shut. Doyle stared, momentarily stunned into silence, the fight finally draining from him. As he was led away, struggling and shouting threats, Grace returned to the podium. The room slowly quieted. "What you witnessed today," she said, her voice heavy but firm, "is the consequence of unchecked power, but it is also the beginning of accountability." She looked directly at the cameras. "The investigation into Councillor Thorne and his associates is active. We will pursue this wherever it leads. This city deserves better." The press conference concluded, but the city was buzzing. News of Doyle's arrest and the implication of Thorne dominated every news outlet. The protests outside the station began to change, the anti-Grace signs replaced by calls for Thorne's resignation. Inside the station, the shift was palpable. Officers associated with Doyle found themselves isolated. Others began quietly cooperating with the Integrity Unit. Ben Carter, watching the arrest unfold, felt a heavy weight lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. But Grace knew the fight wasn't over. Thorne was deeply entrenched, politically savvy. He wouldn't surrender easily. The battle had moved from the station corridors to the highest levels of city power, and the stakes were higher than ever. The satisfying click of handcuffs on Kevin Doyle's wrists wasn't an ending. It was merely the end of a chapter. His dramatic arrest, broadcast live, sent shockwaves through Brisbane, shattering the illusion of impunity that had long protected him and his network. But Councillor Marcus Thorne, the powerful politician implicated alongside Doyle, was a different kind of adversary. Smoother, more politically entrenched, and far more dangerous when cornered. While Doyle faced the judicial process, Thorne launched a sophisticated counterattack. He didn't rely on street-level intimidation. He wielded influence like a scalpel. Suddenly, Chief Superintendent Grace Kirby found her reform initiatives stalled in council committees. Budget requests were questioned, delayed indefinitely. Allies she thought she had in city government grew distant, their calls unanswered. Anonymous editorials appeared in mainstream newspapers, subtly questioning her leadership style, her experience, framing her necessary cleanup actions as reckless and destabilizing. Thorne's strategy was clear: isolate Grace, starve her command of resources, and paint her as an ineffective leader, incapable of managing the city's complexities, thereby undermining the very mandate for reform she represented. Grace recognized the playbook immediately. This was power protecting itself, using bureaucracy and insinuation as weapons. She met with Deputy Commissioner Bell and her team. "They're trying to bleed us out," Bell stated grimly, reviewing the latest budget cuts proposed by Thorne's allies on the council. "Doyle was the symptom. Thorne is the disease," Grace replied, her jaw set. "We cut off the head." But attacking Thorne directly was perilous. He was insulated by layers of political connections and plausible deniability. The evidence they had, the emails of the financial links from Doyle's activities, was strong, but Thorne's lawyers were already muddying the waters, claiming Doyle acted alone, that Thorne was merely a victim of association. Grace knew they needed something more, something irrefutable. She turned her focus back to the files Constable Ben Carter had rescued, specifically the hints about buried cases and manipulated internal reviews. She tasked Bell and a small, completely trustworthy internal unit to discreetly reopen investigations into specific controversial incidents where Doyle's name appeared alongside Thorne's political interests. Zoning disputes that mysteriously favored Thorne's donors, dropped charges against well-connected individuals, police resources suspiciously diverted. Simultaneously, Ben Carter, now working closely with Grace's internal team, started connecting with other younger officers, individuals disillusioned with the old guard, but previously too fearful to speak out. He shared his own story, the fear, the guilt, the eventual decision to act. Slowly, cautiously, others began to come forward, providing details about cases Doyle or his allies had pressured them to handle certain ways, about reports that were altered, about evidence that went missing. A clearer picture of Thorne's direct influence began to emerge. The break came unexpectedly. An older clerk in the city planning department, nearing retirement and burdened by years of complicity, contacted Grace anonymously. She provided dated memos, signed by Thorne himself, explicitly directing zoning changes that benefited developers who were also major campaign contributors, developers whose problematic sites had received suspiciously lenient police attention coordinated by Doyle. It was the direct link, the proof of quid pro quo. Armed with this new evidence, Grace bypassed the local political structure, presenting the comprehensive findings directly to the State Crime and Corruption Commission, CCC, and the Australian Federal Police, AFP. The investigation escalated rapidly. Federal and state agents executed search warrants at Thorne's council office and related businesses. The evidence mounted: financial records, incriminating emails, testimony from the clerk, and now several police officers granted immunity. Thorne, blindsided by the speed and scope of the joint agency intervention, found his political shield evaporating. His allies deserted him. His lawyers advised cooperation. Within weeks, Marcus Thorne was indicted on multiple counts of bribery, official corruption, and conspiracy. His arrest, though less dramatic than Doyle's, signaled the true dismantling of the corrupt network. The city of Brisbane seemed to exhale collectively. The dark cloud of fear and suspicion that had lingered for so long began to lift. The protests outside the station transformed, no longer demanding resignations, but participating in community forums, discussing the future of policing, contributing to the reform process Grace had initiated. The station itself began a slow, often difficult, transformation. Chief Superintendent Kirby, supported by Bell and a growing number of reform-minded officers like Ben Carter, implemented the new training protocols, strengthened internal standards, and worked closely with the Community Liaison Committee. The changes weren't instantaneous. The scars remained, but the culture began to shift from one of impunity to one of accountability. Grace Kirby often stood at her office window, watching the city below. The fight had been brutal, costly. It had tested her resolve, forced her to confront betrayal, and put her and her loved ones at risk. But looking out at the community beginning to heal, seeing officers engage differently with citizens, witnessing the first green shoots of trust emerge, she knew it had been necessary. Justice, she reflected, wasn't a single victory or a final destination. It was the ongoing, relentless pursuit of fairness, the constant vigilance required to keep the shadows at bay. The journey was far from over, but under her leadership, Brisbane had taken a crucial, undeniable step towards a better future. Grace Kirby's story is a powerful reminder that true leadership often requires confronting uncomfortable truths and challenging entrenched systems, even at great personal risk. Her battle against corruption wasn't just about removing bad actors. It was about restoring faith, rebuilding trust, and fundamentally changing a culture that allowed injustice to fester. It shows that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. For anyone who feels overwhelmed by systemic problems, who believes change is impossible, Grace's journey offers a lesson. Persistence matters, integrity matters, and the actions of determined individuals, supported by community, can indeed dismantle empires built on fear. The fight for justice is rarely easy, and victory is often measured in slow, incremental steps. But every step forward, every voice raised, every instance of accountability contributes to a more equitable future. If this story of resilience, courage, and the fight for systemic change inspired you, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with others who believe in the power of truth and the possibility of reform. Let's keep the conversation going and continue championing the stories that matter. Thank you for watching.